Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm here to welcome us all to the fourth and the final webinar in the MIT Africa Lecture Series. My name is May Hessen. I am the MIT Africa Faculty Director, and I am an associate professor in course 17, Political Science. A little bit about myself. Most of my research is on African politics, with specialization particular in Kenya, as well as in my native Sudan. This is my second year at MIT and my first full year as MIT Africa Faculty Director. And we've had a really spectacular year. I've had the amazing opportunity to work with our Managing Director, Ari Jacobowitz, as well as with a whole host of really exciting people around the Institute to bring you all, to bring MIT and the Institute a whole host of really exciting initiatives from our new impact fund that we've started to help fund students pitch endeavors in their home countries, to bringing Swahili to MIT's campus, as well as launching this really amazing lecture series. So a little bit more about the series. We're delighted to be collaborating with the MIT Alumni Association on this webinar series that features lectures by different MIT faculty members as they discuss their ongoing research activities in or on Africa. For those of you all who couldn't attend our past three lectures, we had our first inaugural lecture on the built environment and urban politics in Africa about a month ago. Then we had a lecture rethinking nuclear energy solutions for the African continent. And last week's lecture was on collaborating on space-enabled designs with African leaders. Before we begin, a quick housekeeping note. We encourage everyone to submit questions in the Q&A box, and we'll try to get to as many as possible during the question and answer session after the lecture. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Professor Chakanesta Mavhunga. In this historically grounded talk, Professor Mavhunga will first locate the MIT-Africa relationship within a longer history dating back to the foundations of the Institute in 1861, 24 years before the partition of Africa at the Berlin Colonial Conference of 1884-1885. The second part of the lecture is going to briefly discuss the role of MIT in Africa during the key moments of European colonialism, from Berlin, 1885, to the liberation struggles in the anti-apartheid movement, to the end of apartheid in 1994, and the 3 decades since. Professor Mavhunga returns to the fact that, unlike Harvard and other peer institutions, MIT does not have an African Studies Center, and therefore no strong focal point for African engagement. Given this history, the final section is going to reflect on the ethics, challenges, and possibilities of MIT Africa engagement in the 21st century as seen from two sides of the Atlantic. So with that, we're very excited to have Professor Mavhunga speaking to us, and I will turn it over to you. Thanks so much, Professor.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. It looks very strange because I haven't had any conversations of an academic nature where we are talking for the last 9 months. Most of the time, I am simply doing things out there in communities, building things in the great county of Nyeri in central Kenya. So if I am a little off, A, it's because I'm jet lagged. I just arrived less than 24 hours ago. And B, it's because I have to relearn being an academic. So the first thing is how to start this slide. I'm using a very strange, can you all see?
Yes, we can see your slides.
Okay, good. So I want to start by saying that the future for MIT Africa engagement is bright if we look at things not just from the need to provide a global education for our students and to realize that we are dealing with a continent that has priorities. I also want to propose that this idea where we just go and do small things with a community where we either do research and so forth, perhaps might be a bit limited and isolated to move the needle in terms of what Africa really needs. With that being said, there is a great opportunity among and goodwill among institutions, universities, governments at different levels, pan-continental institutions, and organs within the United Nations to both facilitate and act as players. There is also really good possibilities that could come from organizations that really deal with innovations in research and education, such as the MasterCard Foundation, which has really struggled, among other organizations, to realize impact despite the huge investment. I will also say that there is money in Africa to fund in things. The African Development Bank in particular will get behind initiatives that promise to transform Africa. Tunde Fafuna will remember that we had these conversations in the MIT Africa Initiative, and it's worth returning to those. But I won't start there. I want to start with a very, it is in 1861 that at MIT is established. The concept of technology at that time is not yet there. It is simply the mechanical arts. And the conversation, the mandate that MIT is given as a land grant institution is to transform the problems of America into opportunities. Case in point, the natural resources, agriculture, building bridges, and other forms of infrastructure, industrialization, et cetera, et cetera. In 1861, we are not yet at a stage where Africa is colonized by Europe. There are parts occupied, but it's not yet colonized by Europe. That begins to take shape around the 1880s. In 1884-85, the Congress of Berlin happens in Germany, where Africa's fate is being decided without its presence. I want us to note this because this is going to be one of the Achilles heel of MIT, where we decide what is good for Africa or what to do in Africa without Africa's presence. And then we sometimes think that is mutual engagement. It is not. 1884-85, Africa is partitioned. There's two things that are going on. The role of the academic in the partition of Africa is neither benign nor innocent. It is academics like Arthur Gobineau and James Hunt for the French and the British who are egging on these two powers to go and colonize Africa, based on the ethnographic or ethnological texts they have developed in their travels across the continent. And so begins when we are talking about the fate of Africa and the colonization of Africa as an aberration to history, just like slavery. With Bartholomew de las Casas, for example, the Spanish missionary priest, centuries earlier in the context of the Americas. We must remember that academics have been complicit in the project of colonialism and slavery. So the umbilical link between slavery in America and Africa is, for me, Berlin is a very key moment in that. So Africa gets partitioned. The role of MIT begins to be one of a training. When you look at the archives, which we combed with my class, Africa for Engineers in 2021, we found that there are students that are listed as coming from Africa. It starts out in the early 1900s as simply African students or students from Africa. Let's be clear that these are white students that were sent by the colonial states to acquire skills to come back and build the colonial infrastructures that my own ancestors, for example, were driven like slaves to construct. So there is that history now that begins to take shape from 1900 right through to the dawn of the birth of Africa's firstborn, Ghana, in 1957, in which MIT aids and abets colonialism with all the responsibilities and benefits. The beginnings of investments in things that are associated with the rise of the United States as a major power, militarily and economically, from the exploitation of chrome resources and cobalt from Congo and my home country, Zimbabwe, to the development of the nuclear bomb, or initially energy, and then the nuclear bomb, the Manhattan Project. These are projects that when you read, the earlier texts that have been written by Dave Kaiser, Dave Mindel, and others, will show very clearly that they were, MIT was part and parcel of the project of the development of nuclear energy. That nuclearization of war was enabled by, in part, South Africa, but largely uranium from Congo and Niger, partly Madagascar, but mostly it's those two. And Gabriel Hecht has, done more than most to actually pass that out for us. So I think now comes the, we need to really think seriously about the ethics of our engagement with Africa. In that period, we are beginning to see something very, very interesting also. There is not yet the Center for International Studies. That comes much later. So engagements with Africa at that time, up until the 60s, are very much around training, admitting students from Africa and training them. The systematization of MIT's conversation with Africa begins from the 1960s onwards. And that's what I want to really elaborate on and build upon. Already, you are beginning to have, by 1971, conversations involving faculty members. Nathan H. Cook, for example, in 1971, he is warning that we do not want to tell a developing country what it needs. Rather, we want a rational, technologically sound method for helping them establish their needs based on their individual goals. You will see that the emphasis is on the new nation state. From 57, there is a slate of independence, African countries becoming independent. And by 1971, much of Africa, more than half of it, is independent. So the charge of MIT switches to how best can we impact the development of a new Africa. It's important to realize that this is very much part and parcel of the Cold War. And so whatever we think about the conversation regarding MIT Africa engagement, it has always been political. It was political then, it is as political now with the role of China. in Africa. So it's not innocent as such. So you begin to see courses that are already emerging in the 1960s as part of this need to counter the Cold War by actually inflecting policy with a capitalistic free market feel. And, courses are developed, some of which mirror very closely what we are doing. Case in point was the one in 1960 when industrial management professor Carol L. Wilson founded the MIT African Fellowship Program, and under which he wanted to help African development ministries, institutions capacitate themselves with well-trained working level assistants by developing both management fellows from MIT Sloan and law fellows from Yale and Harvard law schools to work with African governments on central economic political issues facing the nascently independent countries. You will also be aware that it's also the Soviets, the Chinese are also doing the same. So it becomes a battle to control the soul of the new African nation state. And a course is actually developed. This is something worth looking at with respect to whether or not our preparation for fielding students is being effective or not. The course 15-31 was a seminar course led by Wilson himself for the purpose of getting these students ready to travel to Africa for social, economic, and political engagement and deploying to several countries throughout the continent. 10 fellows per year between 1960 and 1965, which was a very good yield, as it were, supported by the Ford Foundation. And tellingly, it did not receive, or so we think, because some of the documents that we found were very, very cheeky. According to Wilson, he did not receive any funding from the United States government, which he felt was a way to ensure that fellows could avoid being regarded as acting on behalf of the United States. And the reason is very clear. It does not want this to be politicized. It also has to do with how do you protect students that are deploying so that they are not seen as espionage agents. And it's very clear, the Africans want above all not to be meddled with. This is in the context of the Angolan War. Patrice Lumumba has just been assassinated. The liberation movements are raging in Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Angola, Cabo Verde, and Guinea-Bissau, and so on and so forth. There's turbulence in North Africa at this particular time, which would result in the assassination of leaders, especially in Egypt. So it's not a time to be political. Again, the question is, how do you deal very in a very nuanced way, carefully considered way with the political when you are engaging Africa? And so this is what is happening now at this point in time.
Chakanesta, I'm sorry to interrupt. Would you press play on the top left there? We'll be able to see the slides better.
Where?
On your screen towards where it says play, the top of the top bar
Here?
there.
No.
Over more. Other side. There, you see where it says play with the play?
Play, yeah. Play slide.
Yeah. Okay,
Wonderful.
yes. Oh, perfect. Thank you so much.
Are we good?
Yes.
So Nathan Cook also goes on to say, when we look at that same year, 1971, when we look at past results, we see that we are quite capable at developing structures, systems, enterprise, etc., just like the ones we have here at MIT. However, we are much less capable of adapting our efforts to match the culture, economy, and technology of the developing nations. Again, something to be really thought seriously as something teachable to us today. This is something that's coming from notes regarding the Sahel Sudan program with USAID. There's no date, and it's written in shorthand. Concern that the results be practical. Given MIT's reputation, there should be great care given to any recommendations we make. Be careful because of the weight which will probably be given to our input because it is MIT. So there is a warning to hubris and a sense that trust us, we are engineers. So let me just cite very quickly, two examples of programs that are going on in the 1970s at this time. One is the African Mathematics Program that took place in 1961 to 76, carried out by the Education Development Center with financial assistance from the U.S. Agency for International Development, the Ford Foundation. Several MIT members contributed to the program, especially William T. Martin. The idea was to improve primary and secondary mathematics education in several African countries: Ghana, Nigeria, Sierra Leone, Ethiopia, Kenya, and Uganda. And the goal was to create a set of math textbooks for schools to use, written in English, as well as set up training workshops for teachers. And two examples that you can see here is the use of graphic design and numbers in order to easily illustrate in terms of quantities. The other one is introducing the concept of sets. And you can see here, it's very adroitly using examples from local, that local people find legible, like sets of birds, sets of fishermen, sets of trees, sets of boats, and so on and so forth. Second example is an interesting one to consider in light of our climate conversation in MIT today, especially on the eve of the establishment of the climate project. In 1971, the U.S. Agency for International Development offered to the UN to create a plan to create a short-term and long-term plan to assist the Sahel Sudan region to deal with persistent drought in Chad, Niger, Upper Volta, which is now Burkina Faso, Mali, Mauritania, and Senegal. And MIT offered to create a task force to help USAID in this endeavor. You will always remember that the idea of creating a task force to deal with a problem is pretty much within the DNA of MIT. But its major role was to do the research on the area in several sectors and create a strategy that would assist the countries and the donors in selecting strategies which will promote long-term sustained improvement in conditions within the area. And that scope of work was quite thorough. In a nutshell, these are some of the programs that were already beginning to happen by 1980. 1980 is when Zimbabwe becomes independent. And the last frontier of colonialism is now unequivocally two countries, Namibia and South Africa. I want to pause there and focus on this very important moment because it has ramifications on how we deal with issues relating to Africa in times of turbulence. And so the anti-apartheid struggle comes to campus from around 1985. And the president of MIT at that time is Paul E. Gray, who refused to divest from apartheid South Africa. Quote, "I believe that it is crucially important for universities to avoid taking political actions except in those rare cases in which the university has a direct, obvious, and immediate interest in the outcome. To do otherwise puts us out on the slippery slope which leads to the legitimization of political control of the university." Now, round about 1985, September 17, the tech ran this piece, and you can see students demonstrating on campus from Harvard, MIT, Tufts, and Boston, crossing Massachusetts Avenue. And this begins now a very turbulent moment on campus. And led by the Coalition Against Apartheid, which was supported by faculty throughout MIT, not all, I have to say, some, but not all, including political science professor William R. Johnson and urban planning professor Melvin H. King. Like I said, MIT never divested its South African assets, and the Coalition Against Apartheid seized its project in 1991 with the release of Nelson Mandela in 1990. By then, it was very clear that South Africa was headed for multi-party rule. Then, as now, you can see the construction of encampments on campus. This is a shanty, and Professor of Urban Studies, Frank S. Jones, was delivering a speech on this particular day on a Friday to commence the divestment demonstration. This is roundabout near the Student Center. You can also see to your right, Professor Melvin H. King addressing another rally, this time on a Tuesday. This is a list of, and the confrontations could sometimes be very just that, confrontational. You can see here a list of students and faculty that were arrested, charged with trespassing and so on and so forth. 32 of them, including the tech photographer Sean Doherty, class of 93. This is now in the 1990s. I'm not giving any specific date. I'm just running through them very quickly. You can clearly see the use of media. We think of digital media today, but at that time, there was a lot of animation work that was going on to show both in numbers and graphically the case against MIT's continued investment in apartheid South Africa. These are cartoons of reflecting the moment. One, parodying the president of the corporation. Second one, same thing, explaining his reasons. The third one, really illustrating, the impact on the ground. These are the numbers. You can clearly see that MIT's investment compared to Harvard was quite minuscule, which was still not justifiable. Harvard was top, Columbia, Yale, University of Michigan, my alma mater, was right there. And so these are quite big numbers. But from the perspective of what remained at the time, there was still concern that MIT's investment was very high. You will forgive me because these numbers on the right are reflective of very specific sectors. I forget which ones, but the graph that you need to be focusing on is the kind of a divestment that remained on the left. So what do we take from the anti-apartheid struggle on campus? Number one, we must always be aware that the question of Africa is going to remain political and must be handled in a way that enables what we are best at doing to flourish in order to correct past mistakes. And one way to do that would be to have a more listening ear, not just to ourselves on campus, but to Africans, if what we truly believe is that we are coming to build mutually. Anyway, the 21st century engagement with Africa is pretty much straightforward. A lot of you may know it. I'll just run very quickly through it. I was part of a project that involved, the shaping of MIT's, what we had intended to be a strategic document to help MIT move forward. But the person who led it was Hazel Saif, who is now at Northeastern. And she, among many others, helped to put the spotlight on a more positive engagement with Africa, particularly South Africa, working very closely with Professor Loyiso Nongwa. At the time, I was at Wits when they started doing these things, around about 2002. I was just winding up at Wits. 2003, I was at Michigan. But these initiatives had already started. And it's not a coincidence that some of them were focusing on mathematics and other kinds of sciences, because Loyiso Nongwa himself was one of South Africa's very best mathematicians, top mathematicians, as vice chancellor. And the idea was to promote exchange. And what was unique about this program was that it shouldn't simply be us taking our students to Africa. We have to also make sure that students come from Africa to here. The problem has always been, how do you finance African students, given that most of the universities are state funded? We are privileged to have all these billions, but African students do not have that budget. What do we do? If we do not act on that, it becomes very asymmetrical. Hazel Saif was also part of starting in 2012, at the initiative of Richard Lister, who was then Vice Provost, to come up with a strategic plan to engage Africa. The concern was that we are too many doing too many small things or some big things, but there is no coordinated effort. As a result, we are not going to have a seed program like Stanford, or an endowed program like the Patrice Motsepe program at Harvard, or the African Development Conference. Huge affairs. Our MIT Innovate tries, I'll be very honest, tries, but it's nowhere near the scale that Harvard has gone. The reason is very simple. They are far more coordinated than we are, period. What is ironic, and what I remember talking to Hazel about this on an elevator going to one meeting, was that Harvard's century must be the one that is behind us, because that was the anti-apartheid, the anti-colonial century. And Harvard's skill set in the humanities and social science, that's its forte, and in law, who placed it well to actually be a leader in that. And many of the leaders that came from Harvard, like in Zimbabwe, Edson Zobgo, for example, most articulate lawyer in Zimbabwe, went on to be third or fourth in the hierarchy of the liberation movement behind the borders. MIT should be leading the 21st century, because after all, we are the top engineering institution in the world. So, but we have ceded this ground in Africa to Harvard, to Stanford, to other quiet players who may not be spectacular, but are doing excellent things. The reason is simple. There is it's a simple law of physics. Find a path of least resistance or a point of least resistance, concentrate your force and mass, and something gives. I am here to see the application of that law of physics at MIT, precisely because there is so much scattering around. So part of what Hazel was trying to do was to bring us all together. Ari can talk more about the Global Startup Lab. This is another initiative that started in 2014. So we did produce the MIT Africa Strategic Plan, By then, I was not sure that the kinds of things that I thought could happen were happening. So I kind of slid out. I have my own thoughts on this. I am sure that some of the findings or recommendations are being implemented. I have no idea. But I still think that the kinds of things we had started talking about are worth really thinking about in light of what peer institutions and others are doing now. There is a big shift away from what we want and what we think is right, or educating our students, to actually saying, what are Africans doing? How can we be part of that effort? So, and to me, you know, that is something that is really worth thinking about. If we really want to impact a continent that will soon, if not already, have the biggest youth population in the world, where there is a deluge of scholarships and fellowships for Africans across the globe, especially among countries that are now facing a really serious skilled workforce, or any workforce at all, deficit as their populations age. So that's something to really think about. What went wrong? What did we do right? Where could we move on these big issues? It's not simply a question of us going to do research, because some of that research turns out is harming Africa, is taking a lot out of Africa than it's giving back. It's not clear who informs it or its purposes. The ethics of that need is not simply up to us. It has to be about institutional review boards, including not only by universities in Africa or government institutions in Africa, but by people at the grassroots level. Do they know what we are doing? Do they know the ramifications, the benefits, the costs? How do we know that they know? And how do we make ourselves the best arbiters of that? So today we have MIT Africa. Again, I don't need to belabor the point. Some of the things that shape it came out of MISTI Africa as part of the MISTI Global. Some of them came from the kind of work that we were doing in the MIT Africa initiative. I want to end here by saying that in the 1970s, MIT recognized the same flaws that I've been talking about in their foreign aid programs. And Professor Nathan Cook proposed that the solution was to have all students and staff planning to work in foreign countries take a semester-long coursework and semesters preparing them for their African aid programs. That extensive research by professors and graduate students, along with members of the foreign country, be conducted at least a year prior to the beginning of any project. But the proposal never became policy at MIT, although I still think that the future of successful, mutually beneficial relations between MIT and African countries cannot escape Cook's proposal more than half a century later. The second thing that I want to end with is what should lead MIT Africa's engagement. I think that the face of MIT Africa engagement should reflect Africa and Africans, for it to be taken seriously beyond its technocratic usefulness and limitations to Africa. I'm happy to elaborate on this, but I think the same way that all those touchy, very stinging nettle-like irritations that undergird who can and cannot go to Native American communities and be a representative there of an institution, or to African American communities, must be extended to Africa. I feel like there's a degree of exception when it comes to who must lead African efforts. And one of the things that I find very strange about the United States in particular is that we have 500 years of history, 400 years of which was under slavery. And we are not realizing that there is we can either make that a point, a kind of sore throat, or we can make that a point of competitive advantage that China does not have, that Europe may not have. The United States, unless you are talking of indirect or financial or economic, did not become an occupying colonial power in Africa. That's an advantage. And yet we continue to suffer the indignity of not utilizing our African diaspora. Even at MIT, we tend to play second fiddle. I don't know why, because I thought this was my continent. And I'm not just going there to research. It's not, Africa is not a study, a place of study or a study subject. Africa is my home. People, they count on me when I'm at MIT that they are on campus. When I'm on campus, they're on campus. When I come back to them, I'm bringing MIT to them. The bridge. That's the major role of the African intellectual at MIT, as a bridge to Africa, a very solid bridge at that, across the Atlantic. So as long as we continue to use MIT, Africa is a place where we send our students to have a global impact, or to learn, to have global exposure in real time, a place where problems are found, where we experiment on dodgy things, or where we go and extract a lot of data, which is the major problem now. A lot of data, we bring it here, we crunch it, we produce big products that we sell, and that have absolutely no benefit to Africa, as COVID illustrated. That mindset has to shift. Otherwise, we are going to be left behind. Already in the United Kingdom, universities like Edinburgh are no longer bringing students to Edinburgh from Africa. They are training them right where they are, assigning them purpose in things that matter to Africans. And that's their thesis. So we have a lot to do in terms of rethinking ourselves. If I'm making anybody uncomfortable, it's because we have to contend with this issue. Seriously, we have to make ourselves uncomfortable that the trajectory of engagement with Africa is not a sustainable one, is not mutual, contrary to what we may say. So mutuality is not something we give. It's not something we at MIT here manufacture and adjudicate. Neutrality is a participative effort. Second from last, we have to think about funding for African initiatives. It's too low. We talked about this too. Mavhunga, remember that this was one of the major issues we talked about in trying to craft the strategic plan. And I think Harvard has done well. We should look at Harvard, the Patrice Motsepe Fellowship. That program is good. It ensures that there's a huge pot of money that funded by Africans to come to Harvard and go back in order to build their countries. And sometimes we have to look at programs whether we should be charging certain fees for Africa programs to train them either as teachers or and so on. I've seen that in the past, and I've said this is not right. A continent that suffered 500 years of slavery, in which individuals within MIT were complicit, should not be paying for the education of its people at MIT. That is simply not right. And it does not in any shape or form build any bridges. So I've already talked about community IRBs, and I won't belabor that point. I want to end here and thank you for listening, and I will take any questions. Thank you.
All right. Hello, thank you for that, Professor. I think that was a very good way to end this series, considering our past and our present and our future. I'm gonna come with some questions from our participants now. This first one's from Rebecca. Thank you, Professor Mavhunga. Do you think there is a justifiable moral argument for reparative initiatives that allocate MIT resources to fund more African student educational programs at MIT and at their local African institutions? Could such initiatives benefit MIT as well as in this next century?
Yes, but it must be led by people of African descent because they feel the pain. That could be a very good bridge towards ensuring that a reparative process built around innovation happens. It would really close a gap that's missing, that is, really yawning right now, where we have to scrounge for money, beg sometimes. Some of us have had the indignity of begging, writing very demeaning letters to colleagues in order to get municipal funding to go and do things that will make MIT great, put it on the map. That just ain't right. It isn't. It's just sad. So there has to be a politics of reparation that, creates value. If structured correctly, a fund like that, a reparative fund like that, would actually amortize itself. It would enable us to bring our minds together towards something that generates more money. That's how an endowment works. Where is the endowment for Africa? It's very sad that we talk about MIT and slavery, and we wax lyrical about those programs at MIT. Where is the money? I would like to see the money that goes towards saying, yeah, a wrong was done here. Now here's the dollar sign. And let's get as many of these people of African descent to come and really talk together and tell us, what do they want? What do they want? It's a very disarming question, very humble. That's a question I want to hear in that debate. It's a debate that's long overdue. It should be moving beyond debate. It's a sustainable way to deal with Africa.
Okay, thank you. So let me ask the next two questions at once because they're very much related. So one is from Samuel, who asks, how may we as African diaspora alums best support MIT Africa engagement along the approach and model you've suggested, especially in mutually capacity building ways? And if your presentation can be accessible to those afterwards, Samuel's also wondering about that to get more details. And the next question comes from Rafaela. Thank you, Professor, for the great talk. My question is, as you mentioned, there is still too much resistance. Sorry, hold on, I lost. There's still too much resistance in engaging the African diaspora as a valuable source of knowledge, capable to contribute to the local development of human capital and of specific sectors. Any advice in how to overcome this issue, which is transversal to all African countries?
Thank you. So I'm happy to announce that I'm coming from Nyeri. I will know there is something that's happening that's unique that I haven't seen at Dedan Kimathi University of Technology in Kenya. I've posted something on LinkedIn. You can check it out. We have just come back from a very extensive scoping mission covering the western part of the country. the idea is that we have identified Nyeri and particularly Dedan Kimathi University as that a point of least resistance upon which to incubate something. The problem with Africa is that things change quickly. There are policy inconsistencies. There are, volatilities. You may know that there are realignments and self-corrections and course corrections happening in West Africa, that are residues of the colonial. And there is stability in one country one day, gone tomorrow. So that has made a lot of African diaspora very reticent to engage with Africa. You may also know that the African continental free trade area is now real. Some countries like Kenya and Ghana have called for what they have called the year of the return. In Ghana, Kenya is following the similar event here in Greater Boston in a few weeks. The idea being to corral Africans to say, you don't have to go to your very specific African country. Africa is a continent of 54 countries. And in there are places where you're welcomed, you're valued, you're loved, you're given space. Your ideas, they are put to use by people who have built things. And here is, Dedan Kimathi is one such place. I've been a mentee of somebody who built that institution from being non-existent to no government interest or input, to a point where, members of parliament were now saying, if we don't go behind this thing, we'll lose. And then took it to former President Mwai Kibaki, who had initially said no. And then the answer was yes. And he built that institution from scratch. Ari was there. You don't even need to listen to me. You can ask him. That is the home of Semiconductor Technologies Lab, which has now just received $400 million in funding to build its infrastructure. It's already operational, but it's now doing things that it wanted to do. 400 million. This is a serious institution. The work that we are doing is we are saying that semiconductors in and of themselves, this is what Cook was saying, they are useless without understanding the political framework, the historical, the deep. Political is not enough. Political science will not save Africa. It's nice, but we need our conversation with Africa to have a deep historical understanding, our culture, not simply as things to be nostalgic about, but scientific and technological. So, and those elements are what we are using to build what we are calling the Dedan Kimathi model. And it's serious. In just 1 year of meeting, we have long since gone post proof of concept. We have now scoped out, convened all the stakeholders from every sector of society, government, industry, philanthropic, communities, you name them, diaspora. So there is already a proof of concept that somebody who is located in the diaspora, Tony was a professor here, can actually come to Africa and be given space in this science park to develop something along lines that are really magical and be trusted with money to actually invest. Company that's investing, interestingly, is also African. So there are things that are happening there. One last thing I'll say on this, and it addresses the both questions, is that as long as we, the diaspora, allow our engagement with Africa, to be funneled through institutions that have a checklist of saying, we do this, we don't do this, we do this, we don't do this, we do this, we don't do this. And MIT right now, the policy at MIT has to be realigned. We can't have an institution that just simply goes to Africa with a checklist, say we do this, we don't do this. What about them? What do they also do? What do they want? So it's a question of realignment. We can't always have our engagement with Africa funneled through what universities want. We can't do that. To do that would be bad. What we could do, though, is we could act within our universities. There are 200 universities and colleges in Greater Boston alone. Do we know each other? Do we know where we are? Have we ever talked to each other? What if we did off campus? And then at each campus, there is a chapter that is feeding into that off campus place. I do think that MIT would derive a lot of benefit in investing in that consortium. We can start with Harvard. Emmanuel Acheampong is very willing to do that, actually. He's ready at Harvard. Let's do this. Let's not, if you come to Kimathi, we will realize that we don't talk that much. We act and we move fast. So there is too much talking among the diaspora. I'm a farmer and a builder of things. I don't have time for that.
Okay, I think we are out of time now, but thank you so much. Thanks everyone for joining. This has been the final lecture in this series, so thanks to everyone that's been involved in making this possible. The Alumni Association, Tunde Fafunwa, all the other speakers that have been here, of course, all the alumni that have joined us. And we encourage you to stay engaged. And I don't know, Professor Mavhunga, if you have any advice on how people can stay engaged, it seems like there's a lot of interest around that.
If they want, so I run a very active LinkedIn page, Chakanesta Mavhunga. That's where I meet most, especially young people. I'm very interested in having young people get engaged and to assure them that there are places we are creating in Africa where they can be welcomed and they can flourish. And then they can take that seed and plant it in their own countries after starting from a point of least resistance, moving to their countries, which may be of most resistance. So please, let's get in touch. At the very least, let's not stay alone. Let's talk.
Okay, thanks so much. And of course, I'm sure the Alumni Association will be sending out more messages about it. And I think all the past lectures will also be posted online to watch in case you missed any of them. Thank you so much to everyone for making this possible, and we'll see you next time.
Last night